So after seeing the Feliks Euphoria at London Can Jam this year, which is their flagship headphone amplifier, I saw that the designers adopted a if it ain't broke mentality when it comes to how these amplifiers look, because they look nearly identical. Both of these are OTL, and they both use the same power and driver preamp tube slots. It should also go without saying that this amplifier can get really hot. This isn't the heat of say the shit Asgard 2, which is a solid state class A amplifier, but this is on a whole other level because of the glowing tube. So take care when you're handling these, and Feliks themselves advise at least 5 minutes wait time minimum after switching off the amplifier before you swap tubes around. And the actual unit is quite solidly built. I'm not going to do any drop tests or anything, but it does look like it would last a long time in a caring household. The volume knob is a satisfyingly smooth turn, and the small LED in the front is blue. There's only a slot for a single 1/4 inch headphone plug, and I would recommend plugging in headphones after the amp is warmed up and unplugging them before turning it off. The reason for this is that there is a loud and cracking sound in the headphones if you turn the amp on when they're plugged in, or if you turn the amp off while they're plugged in. So I think Feliks told me when I talked to them at London Can Jam that this was something they remedied in the 2017 version of the amp. Mine is 2016, but I'd advise it regardless. Speaking of the 2017 version, I did ask them some details of how the new model differs from mine, and they said they learned some engineering tricks to implement while developing the Euphoria when it comes to sound isolation of the unit, and they decided to let those upgrades trickle down to the Elise as well. A specific example I was told is that the Elise is now less susceptible to annoying interference from phone frequencies during an incoming call or text message. I've never really heard such interference in my Elise, but people don't usually call me anyways, so yeah. On the back of the unit is one set of RCA inputs and one pair of RCA line outputs, which in the manual are referred to as the preamp mode. There is a place to plug in your power cable of choice and a bright red on-off switch. I would have preferred the switch to have been in the front somehow, but it isn't really a big deal. Finally, the kinds of tubes that are officially endorsed by Feliks Audio to be used in this amplifier are printed on the manual, and these include the standard 6AS7G power tubes and the standard 6SN7 driver tubes, and several variants. So I'm quite new to tube amplifiers myself, so I can't really give you an accurate idea of what other tubes you can roll besides the ones listed on the screen right now, but I can tell you that I use a RCA 7N7 through a converter sometimes, and I believe that that works just fine, so no problems there. So the sound. So in my review of the shit layer 2, I did mention how any tube rolling would just modify the flavor of the sound rather than overhaul it in any large way. This is because the amp's output stage was solid state and not flexible at all, as it's a hybrid tube amp. The Elise is able to roll both power tubes as well as driver tubes, and I found it quite sensitive to changes in both. So the amp is not highly transparent by any means, but it does respond very well to different tube configurations. To my ears, the Elise will always embody that stereotypical outlook of tubes, which is warm and euphonic. It's not muddy, however, and detail retrieval is quite good. And the staging is not large by any sense, but it has a very natural depth to it that does positional audio justice. So when comparing the Elise to the Euphoria, I found that it had a warmer tilt to the sound than its elder brother. The terms warm and gooey come to mind, but I would argue that this is a far more articulate experience in stock configuration than the solid state Cavalli liquid carbon that I used to have. So there's no bloat with either Elise or Euphoria, and it was quite obvious to me, even in the really loud background noise of the show floor, that the Euphoria was set up to be a leaner, brighter, and more detailed sound with wider staging, slightly wider staging. So yeah, there were some visitors to the Feliks booth at Can Jam who preferred the Elise over the flagship, simply because it has a warmer and slightly thicker sound. So if that sounds more to your liking, then you will probably prefer the Elise as well. The Elise's customizability makes it wear different hats with ease. So if you need a faster sound for rock and metal, switch to the Mullard 6080 power tubes. If you need a smoother, more relaxing tone, use the stock Svetlana 6AS7G power tubes. So you're probably thinking, a tube amp that changes with tubes, well, what of it? Yeah, but this is a tube roller's dream at its price range and build due to just how much can be done with it. So the Headfire forums have threads bursting with impressions from Elise owners, and for a reason, because this is an affordable OTL with good baseline specifications for dynamic headphones, and the ability to explore different tube pairings really comes easily to it. But on its own, it's a dependable amp, and as mentioned before, the staging is not especially wide, although this varies with different tubes, and the sound has a lusher characteristic that I now find lacking in most solid-state amplifiers. The bass does not extend especially far with the stock tubes, but this is also something that has changed up with rolling. Rather than stretching out the sound to reveal the low-level detail in your recordings, a task that is done to varying degrees by other tube amplifiers, the Elise simply seeks to add tone to your music. This is not an amplifier for detailed retrieval feeds, and this is also not an amplifier for people who want to use it with planar magnetic headphones due to its low wattage. Indeed, I paired this with a few Odyssey planars and found the sound a bit lacking compared to what I know they can do. So the tonal differences were eye-opening to me, as someone who has primarily had experience with solid-state amplifiers in the past. So the Schiit Valhalla 2, which I reviewed before, is leaner and brighter than the Elise, and then the Schiit Lair 2, which is a hybrid tube amplifier, is more punchy and dynamic, but it lacks that natural sound that the Elise can have. And by natural, I mean that the Elise is not etched or hard in its treble presentation, making it so the twang of acoustic guitars and the playing of grand pianos don't sound artificially propped up for the sake of utmost clarity. The sound isn't neutral, but I often find things sounding, within reason depending on genre, they sound really live instead of a pristine studio recording. I appreciate this, and it definitely and quickly caught me off guard and taught me about the benefits of tube amplifiers. So before I received my Elise in the mail, I was kind of worried about something. You see, I used a Focal Utopia as a reference, and it is an 80 ohm dynamic driver headphone. And it wasn't until after I bought the Elise that I found out that the output impedance of it is actually quite high compared to solid-state amplifiers. It's 40 to 50 ohms depending on where you read. Now this breaks the 1/8 rule of output impedance when it comes to headphones, where it says that you should have headphones have impedance of over 8 times the output impedance of the amplifier that you're listening to with them. So, but once I plugged the Utopia in, it sounded just great to me. And it didn't have as black of a background as solid-state amplifiers or my newer Dragon Inspire HA1, but it was very listenable and very enjoyable. So I didn't have any such problem so much with output impedance impeding on the sound quality of the Utopia so much. And it had a very smooth characteristic to the sound as well, which I'm pretty sure some people would enjoy because the Utopia is quite frantic in how it presents itself, and the treble can get a little fatiguing for some people at times. So, tube rolling. Now the point of telling you about tube rolling today is so you don't have, I'm not trying to tell you that you need to go buy a bunch of tubes with Elise to properly enjoy it, but it's kind of to detail what aspects can be changed by what. Also, the tube option of the Tungstol 6SS7s might be discontinued because they did tell me at CanJam that they're having trouble pairing them and getting matching pairs all the time, so they might as well just switch to the PS Vane driver tubes, which are already stocked with the Euphoria, and they might just switch to those for the Elise as well. And you can upgrade to the PS Vane driver tubes, I believe, for an additional $150, which brings the price of the Elise up to $1,000. So, let's start with the Svetlana Winged C 6AS7Gs, and these are the stock power tubes for both the Euphoria and the Elise. It has a warm and slightly thick tone to it with the Elise, which gives a smoother sound to music. It's not particularly fast or heavy hitting, it's kind of laid back in that way. Vocals have a lot of body to them, and bass extension is quite good, so it definitely gel with the ZMF Icon that I have, which is a headphone which has a bit of a peak at 5K, and this smooths that out a bit. Now the major disadvantage of this is that it seems a bit veiled. Of course, this is tied to its inexpensive nature, but the same power tube sounded quite different out of the Euphoria, which I found interesting, with wider staging and a more bright and detailed retrieval Latin way about it, and that has something to say about the amp design rather than just tube design. I couldn't help but make comparisons to the Kawai Liquid Carbon once again, and I have no doubt that the Elise using these stock power tubes is still a very, very much more articulate experience than the quad liquid carbon. And Feliks knew what they were doing because they chose this for both their amplifiers, and it's a very good and inexpensive jack of all trades kind of sound. But it's very good as a baseline, so you know what you're listening to, then you can go further with upgrades if you choose to. The General Electric 68S7G. So I go so far to call this the most V-shaped power tube of the three I'm talking about today. It injects a hefty amount of bass into the Elise's sound. It's not very bloated or distorted bass. It's quite clean. But even though it's quite clean, it's not that much faster and punchier than the stock Svetlanas, and it does have some weight to it because kick drums sound instantly more noticeable in mixes. The mid-range is a bit recessed, but not overwhelmingly so, just slightly. I found guitars to sound a little hollow, and male vocals to be emphasized over female by quite a margin. The treble extension is decent, but misses out on some treble cymbal clarity and weight. Overall, I prefer the stock Svetlanas over this, but I do appreciate how much of these sound better for electronic genres of music. Let's move on to the Mullard 6080s. Now, these are my favorite power tubes that I have for the Elise. So these bring the Elise more in line with my preference these days. The Mullards are a little bit less tubey than the Svetlanas, and they're more geared towards a solid-state sound in terms of impact and dynamics and noise floor. So I have no way of measuring exactly, but I do hear a quieter background with the Utopia over the stock power tubes when I'm using the Mullards. So impact is an understatement of sorts, because these power tubes provide a good punch to the sound of the Elise. With the Utopia, it's a great pairing due to the headphone's own fast and dynamic nature. I quite frankly hate when an amplifier holds the Utopia back in this regard, and so far I've only heard the liquid carbon do that. But the Mullards reduce the slightly thick and overly warm sound of the stock Svetlanas and open up the mid-range to better detail retrieval, so micro detail comes out better with all the various percussion and instrumentation and Michael Jackson's "Don't Stop Till You Get Enough" not being held back by any sort of veil like with the stock power tubes. So bass is quicker on its feet, tap dancing through the mix with precision without any bloat or emphasis. But fans of a bloomier sound will probably not enjoy the Mullards, as it's more lean and more precise in my opinion. Another noticeable upgrade from the stock tubes resides in the upper mid-range and the lower treble, because the air region is better served by the Mullards, with string sections coming out better and faster, and grand pianos also have a less weighty aspect to them, which is also quite a bit cleaner. The disadvantages I can think of are probably headphone reliant in this case, because while I very much enjoy the sound of my Utopia, I feel that it will kind of hurt on the HD800. The treble is also more emphasized compared to the stock tubes, which is another reason why I believe the above. With a bad headphone pairing, and to those who are sensitive to treble, I feel that the Mullard 6080s will quickly become fatiguing, but for warmer headphones I can't recommend them enough for its price point. And now we move on to driver, or otherwise known as preamp tubes. So let's start with the stock ones. These are the Tungsol 6SN7 GTBs made in Russia. So as of September 2017, these are the stock driver tubes provided with the Elise, and it should be noted that for an additional $150, like I said before, you can upgrade to Chinese-made PS main driver tubes that Feliks will be making the switch to only using eventually, as they've done with the Euphoria. So the Tungsols have a slightly tall sound, and what I mean by this is that it sounds like the notes occupy more space than they do on a solid-state amplifier, or even some other tube amplifiers. This space is not width-wise, but rather vertical, because a snare head will sound larger than life instead of a more accurate sting in a mix. I won't lie, this has a very pleasing sound to it, as there's no lack of real estate to be used up here. I would not call it a reference sound though, but it is very fun to listen to, and the Tungsols share this aspect with the Kenrad 6SN7 GTBs, which I'll be talking about later on in the review. But where it differs from the Kenrads is in the air and treble presentation, because the larger-than-life sound described above is not emphasized in the bass region on the Tungsols, but rather in the mids and highs. You will hear a guitar solo pierce through the mix with additional emphasis given to it than other tubes, and you will hear vocals sound very much like an intimate live setting. It's not an especially revealing tube, and I do feel like it might have been chosen along with the Svetlana power tubes To give the widest experience gap between the Elise and a solid-state amplifier at its price point, stick an HD800 into the Elise with its stock tubes and you will be treated to a sound that is less referenced but more musical and, dare I say, more enjoyable. With the ZMF Icon, I found that the treble peak was smoothed out with the stock tube pairing, while with the Mullard 6080s gave slightly more accuracy. So the Sylvania 1950s Chrome Top 6S and 7. Now I would go so far to say that this is my reference 6SS7 driver tube these days, with it almost always being used in my Dragon Inspire IHA1 when I'm critically listening. This is mainly due to its lean sound and detail retrieval, along with it having some of the best extended and natural treble I have in my possession in terms of tubes. But how does it sound on the Elise? I actually don't prefer it compared to on my Dragon Inspire. This could probably be because of personal preferences, but I do feel like the Sylvanias don't bring as much to the table on the Elise. I feel like they're a bit stunted because of the Elise's topology compared to how they shine on the IHA1. I also believe that the detail retrieval boost is minimal on the Elise, used to it being far greater. So I don't prefer this so much. I feel like other tube options that I have in the driver tubes offer a lot more. And with that in mind, let's talk about the Kenrad 6S and 7 GTs. Now let me preface this by saying that this tube is overkill with the stock Svetlana power tubes. These very much need the leaner and quicker sound of the Mullard 6080 to shine. This has the deepest and most powerful bass of all the driver tubes I'm discussing today. Couple that with its level of low-end control and you have a fantastic pairing for electronic genres, pop music, or rock music. With an overall warm sound in the mid-range and a bit of roll-off in the treble, I would actually not recommend the Kenrads for people who want a more analytical listening experience, but it is a balls-to-the-wall level of fun and how exhilarating it is for the right genres. So my earlier description of a tall sound with the Tungsol driver tubes is taken a step further with the Kenrad driver tubes. And a good example of what I mean is in the song Dreams by Fleetwood Mac. There's a single note synthline that plays in the chorus that is normally quite thin and distant in mixes. But on the Kenrads, however, that synthline is very front and center and sounds thicker, meatier, and livelier. And those are a lot of words to describe a mere synth accompaniment to a chorus, but imagine that effect applied to everything in the mix, instrumentation and vocals. It's a very huge sounding tube, and it's not all that reference, but it makes up for its lack of air by making music sound bombastic with a speaker-like quality. Now, RCA 7N7s with a 7N7 to 6SN7 converter. Now, this is the opposite case with Sylvanias. I actually prefer these more on the Elise than I do on the IHA1. And the reason for that is because while these do have the ability to present delicate micro detail and have a leaner sound than the stock option, and especially the Kenrads, the reason they gel more with a warmer amplifier like the Elise than the leaner and more analytical one like the IHA1 is due to the treble region becoming harsher on the latter, while this aspect is a bit moss on the Elise. This is just speculation on my end, but it does become a more fatiguing listen on the Dragon amp. Another strength of the RCA 7N7 is that its low price compared to other detail head driver tubes that I have, especially the Sylvania 6SN7 Chrome Tops. So when listening to jazz, it becomes obvious that these have good tonality for cymbals, snares, and acoustic instruments, but they do retain some body to them. Less than the Sylvanias, but enough to make it a good pairing for these genres of music, along with classical and classic rock. So let's talk really quickly about amping, as it is an amp after all. So I have to reiterate this one aspect of the Feliks audio Elise. This is not a powerful amplifier. As mentioned before, I did not enjoy how it sounded with the Odyssey LCD series. I would not recommend this to be used with any planers at all, and I wouldn't recommend using IEMs with it either because of its high output impedance. I'm still surprised that it sounds as good as it does with the Utopia, but it's no coincidence that many prefer this for their 600 ohm Bayer Dynamic T1s and Sennheiser HT800s. So basically, dynamic driver headphones are the way to go with the Elise, and I'm pretty certain of that. So the Elise met and surpassed my expectations from a first actual tube amplifier. It has a natural tone to it and can be altered with various tube pairings, Unlike the Layer 2, it can be morphed in a more audibly meaningful manner to suit your preferences. Indeed, it might be that I could just reach the detail retrieval prowess of his elder brother, the Feliks Euphoria, or even my Dragon amp, given the right tube pairings, but I didn't pursue those because they're quite expensive, I hear. And I will leave such discoveries to you, the viewer, or other owners. And I do recommend going to, if you're interested in this amp, go to Headfi, look through the threads. There's quite a few threads of Elise owners, and they all have impressions up there. And there's a very interesting discussion going back several years. So one consistent thing about the Elise is no matter the tube pairing, it has the ability to have a very smooth and enjoyable sound. So after months with it, I can understand why some would find it immediately more enjoyable than the Euphoria on first listen when they first hear the two at Can Jam. While the Euphoria is not sparse in tone, it has its own strength and body, the Elise is akin to more what people seem to expect from a tube amplifier with its stock power and driver tube pairing. It's smooth, it's laid back, and it's very musical. It doesn't try to be a low-level detail resolving monster like some other tube amplifiers, but it aims to be for those people who want a more organic sound than their solid-state options can provide, with a gentle bloom in the bass and some mid-range weight. So that has been my review of the very nice Feliks Audio Elise, and I hope to review the Euphoria someday. And coming up next probably will be my review of the Dragon Inspire IHA1, another tube amplifier. As you can see, I'm going quite tube nuts these days. If you go on my Discord channel, you'll see I have impressions of tubes. I'll probably end up doing tube reviews now. Who knows? Well, thanks for checking it out, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.